One of the things that I've treasured about Cave is that the sort of space it has created for what is here in the title anyways referred to as experimentation. And it allows for many of us involved to engage this space in the mood of experimentation. And for me, that's meant engaging the space somewhat predictably, I suppose, as a writer. And I have been contributing to this spirit of experimentation by working on a book. And I am proposing to read from this book, parts of it, and share that with you in the spirit of inviting you into the activities, the sort of experimental, experiential aspects of this space. Now, the book is titled, at least provisionally, it's titled Tunings, with the inevitable colon, Essays, Instruments, and Worlds. And I'm going to start by giving you a bit of a sense of what's going on in the connection between essays, instruments, and worlds. But then I really want to follow through on the title of Tunings of the World and really think for a while about the issue of the world. Now, this is going to be a bit scratchy because I'm going to kind of drop in and out of things. And I'm saying that, and I'm obviously creating the illusion that when I'm lecturing or whatnot, it's not scratchy, but of course it is. But I just want to sort of highlight that aspect of this form of experimentation. All right, tunings, essays, instruments, and worlds. It's common today to be reminded by scholars that in the ancient Western world, aesthetics had no intimate or immediate connection to art. It referred, specifically in this context, to human perception, and even more particularly, to the perception of an individual, not a collective or social perception, and perception of what? Appearances. This reminder is not infrequently motivated by a desire to situate the Western emergence of aesthetics as a field of human inquiry focused on the arts in the 18th century, so quite a bit later. The century we now, I think, refer to generally as that of the century of disenchantment. Although accurate, this historicist approach does not always clarify that human inquiry focused on the arts in its most detailed and careful forms actually did, in fact, insist upon the relation between art and human perception. For example, Kant, in his Critique of Judgment, expressly tied what he called beauty and the beauty of an artwork to the human cognitive experience of trying to make sense of the work. For him, beauty was the word best used to describe the experience of holding an appearance in our imagination while playing with different possibilities of understanding it. Beauty was, in this sort of cliched sense, in the beholder, but not as a matter of taste or opinion, but as a matter of perception. And it was this quality that made aesthetic judgment, at least in Kant's understanding, assume what universal pretensions it might. To designate the relation between an appearance held in imagination and the event of understanding, Kant used the German word Stimmung, a word whose connotations extend from the human voice to mood to world harmony, or what I'll be calling here attunement. An aesthetic perception is one that expresses some form of accord between things and thought. That a sonic, even Pythagorean figure would seem fitting here invites reflection, as it seems expressly grasped designed to grasp the means by which differences touch without converging. Although her point is a different one, the political theorist Jane Bennett has invited us to consider the important way in which vibration animates both mind and matter. A useful, I will suggest, way to elaborate this reflection about Stimmung is through research, believe it or not, on musical essays, where printed language and sound attune in the distinctive form of an essay. Not essays about music, but music that operates like an essay. And how does an essay operate? In both its familiar literary and more recent cinematic forms, an essay operates as an experiment, as the playing out of a hunch about how the process of human reflection might expose itself to others through a recording medium. The proposition that the essay is a search rather than a summation is at bottom an observation about the struggle for attunement. Can the event of thinking, of feeling, of sensing be brought into accord with the constraints of the recording medium? The widely acknowledged reflexivity of the essay form finds its footing here. The essay, regardless of topic, is always about itself as an experiment with resonance. The musical essay operates similarly despite the shift of medium from print to phonography, whether analog or digital. Here too, musical sound is fashioned to stage an experiment in expression. Can this be said? Can others hear it? Can I hear it? What will they hear in my experiment? Musical practice, whether forming essays or not, broaches the theme of attunement in two other ways that I would like to spend a bit of time with here in a preliminary fashion. On the one hand, there is the matter of temperament and musical tunings. Crucially here, musical expression at the level of sound, everything from pitches to pulses, involves the human ear. Temperament and the tuning involved in setting it registers the psychoacoustical fact that pure or natural note frequencies often sound, in fact, may always sound wrong, perhaps even the very opposite of beautiful. The offending frequencies must be tempered, tuned out. Although not typically stressed in the voluminous scholarship on various tempering systems, from Pythagoras to Harry Partch and beyond, oral perception, the human ear, is inscribed within temperament. The well-tempered clavier is one whose strings are wound around the ears that will listen to them vibrate. This insistent and enduring appeal to the subject assumes a distinctive and underanalyzed emphasis in the global musical explosion of the 1960s, largely in the West, but not exclusively. And for this reason, various of the guitar tunings developed then, perhaps in an exemplary way by Robert Fripp, who's generated something he calls the new standard tuning. These invite scrutiny. How and where did these tunings develop? And what does it teach us about the status of attunement in global popular music and expression? On the other hand, as reference to global popular music makes clear, Stimmung, as rendered by the Austrian literary scholar Leo Spitzer as world harmony, urges that one approach the analysis of what is currently called world music, I think, differently. Instead of focusing on the ethnomusicological vocabularies put in play within world music, a treatment that invites reduction of world music to a marketing category. What attunement invites is an examination of what world means when it is understood to arise distinctly in sound. Is this world merely the projection of cultural difference? Is attunement possible, even desirable, across such differences? Significantly, the most powerful post-Kantian reflection on Stimmung and Welt, world, transpires in the work of Martin Heidegger. And despite his persistent reference to poetry and tones, he resists working out how a rich phenomenological account of world might illuminate its deep resonance with sound. The matter here is not to be confused either with the world of sound or the sound of the world, the so-called whistlers that Doug Kahn has been interested in for so long. But instead, what becomes of interest, at least to me, is what might become thinkable when avoiding this confusion. And then how does it help us grasp the force of what we mean by world in world music? A force that in proliferating possible worlds undermines rather than consolidates their cultural hierarchies. Elaborating responses to these kinds of questions and questions that resemble these questions will emphasize what I think might be the opening onto a set of political reflections with regard to what I'm calling here tunings. But let us think more deliberately about the chiasmus, the world of music, music of the world. The US scholar and musician, Robert Brown, is widely credited with having confected the concept of world music. More a category than a proper concept, world music, as developed by Brown, was designed to produce an object for the emergent academic field of what he called musical ethnography. The world in question would appear to be the world Lévi-Strauss's English translator captured in the expression world on the wane, translation for Christophique. This is a world that in principle has an end, that comes to a terminus. In 1953, just a year after the debut of Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, Brown founds the journal of what he calls the Society of Ethnomusicology. In its first issue, one finds the following paragraph under the recurrent section, recordings. Quote, James Van Horn calls attention to the problem of recording the Snoqualmie Indians before their tribal group disappears. He says that Jerry Canham, 78, chief of the Snoqualmie, is willing to sing traditional songs at his home in Carnation, Washington. And most importantly, Canham is the last qualified person to do so. One can imagine here, albeit a little cynically, Alan Lomax, perhaps even Zora Neale Hurston racing around the country in their retrofitted Model T Ford, trying desperately to save the world of folk music. Perhaps every archive emits a distinct, if faint, apocalyptic tone. Although he did not always link the world to his critique of Orientalism, Edward Said's insistence on culture's imbrication in the uneven geopolitics of empire urges us to recognize in the world of ethnomusicology precisely musical traditions quickly being decimated by modernization as mobilized by the West against the rest. The waning of the world was being simultaneously facilitated and redeemed by what Evan Eisenberg called the recording angel, giving, I think, a new, even startling sense to the wax and wane binary. It will hardly come as a surprise to this audience that world music has, has received recently considerable scholarly attention. One thinks here of Timothy Taylor's Music in the World, but even perhaps more pertinently of Stephen Feld's A Sweet Lullaby for World Music. Taylor, prolific and impassioned though he is, never quite manages to invert his title and explore the world in music, preferring instead to explore and problematize the logic of branding, or perhaps genreification, by which world simply means global capital. Of course, there's much to be said for this line of argument, but if stated too baldly, Taylor's thesis achieves in writing the totalization that capital is to be confronted and condemned for seeking to achieve. Is it necessary, when agreeing that world music is indeed a brand, to concede that the world is too? What sort of brand, and with what implications for the theoretical practices that mobilize it? When the world wanes, is it simply because it has reached the end of something like a shelf life? Taylor, whose collection dates from just 4 years ago, is aware of Feld's earlier intervention, and while he mimics in certain respects Feld's critique of diversity, he lets slip precisely those aspects of Feld's analysis that might usefully separate world and global capital. To be fair, the arc of Feld's essay invites readers to skim its more theoretically provocative formulations, but they are there to be read. For example, quote, whatever the success of these aims, the forging of the term ethnomusicology, the terminological dualism that distinguished world music from music helped reproduce a tense division in the academy, where music understood as non-Western or ethnically other continued to be routinely partitioned from those of the West. The binary reproduced by the world music concept thus participated in reinscribing the property attributed to texts that prevented them from meaning whatever elite Western theorists, I'm sorry, I've skipped a page. Binary reproduced concept thus participated in reinscribing the separation of musicology, constructed as the historical and analytical study of Western European art musics, from ethnomusicology, constructed by default as the cultural and contextual study of musics of non-Europeans, European peasants, and marginalized ethnic or racial minorities. The relationship of the colonizing and the colonized thus remain generally intact when distinguishing music from world music, end quote. While it would be misleading to suggest that Feld has no use for the concept of global capital, what is emphasized here is an insight more typically attributed to post-colonial theorists, namely that the world is at odds with itself. The world of world music is thus riven by an encounter with otherness that simultaneously provokes and solicits a Eurocentric conception of a world whose unity is only thinkable through the epistemological options this conception authorizes. Although it would take us far afield, at stake here is the set of issues that during the era of anti-colonial struggles often led non-white partisans of the left to hesitate before aligning with putative comrades monomaniacally absorbed in the struggle against capital. One might think here of Aimé Césaire's fancy footwork in the justly celebrated discourse on colonialism, where his relation to the French left is a very vexed and interestingly articulated one. Be that as it may, Feld elaborates a further distinction within world music between anxiety and celebration, urging us to consider how our listening might respond to the possible worlds circulating in world music, and thus tying the human subject to the worlds of the senses. Phrased in the genre of summation, thinking through the concept of world music thus puts directly in play the problem of how we might theorize what the world can be if its waning is indexed to practices at once ethnographic and musicological, seeking to capitalize on its survival. A second important articulation of the chiasmus, world and music, music and world, follows directly from my reference here to Eurocentrism and its muted invocation of Said's concept of worldliness, a property he attributed to texts that prevented them from meaning whatever elite Western theorists, himself included, said they meant. Introduced already in Beginnings, folded haphazardly within worldliness was a set of theoretical assumptions that Said, despite his awareness of Heidegger, never bothered to bring into contact with the distinction between world and earth in the latter's 1935 lecture, The Origin of the Work of Art. What this cost Said might be broadly construed as a reduction of the work of art, an effect to be regretted because it forestalled geopolitical reflection on the very motif of origin, a reflection that required Jacques Derrida to work out. The origin of the work of art, and so I'm turning now directly toward Heidegger, dates from the mid-30s and precedes the age of the world picture, Weltbild, right, by a few years. Both fall in the wake of Heidegger's fateful affiliation with the National Socialist Party, an affiliation whose despicable anti-Semitic motivations, the recently published Schwarze Hefte, the Black Notebooks, have brought out. Although Heidegger's invocation of world Judaism was unknown to him, it is this kind of history that ultimately turned Herbert Marcuse against Heidegger, who, as for many others, like Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, etc., embodied the hope of a philosophy of the concrete, a philosophy immediately that is not abstractly engaged with the world. What world was this? Marcuse ultimately decided that this world was an enticing version of the otherwise uninteresting philosophical world of abstraction. But before we accept the implicit hypothesis that the world's abstractness was a sure sign of its anti-Semitic conceptualization, let us ask what is to be gleaned from Heidegger's various characterizations of it, especially as these might bear generatively on the phenomenon of worlding. Readers of the origin of the work of art know that it turns decisively toward poetry as the model of the work of art. And in this, it restates the conclusion of Hegel's lectures on aesthetics, but without his insistence on the teleology of form. Instead, Heidegger approaches the matter ontologically, putting great stress on the structure of poetry's relation to its conditions of possibility. And it is precisely here that he introduces the distinction I've already mentioned between earth and world. As I'm interested in what happens to world in such a distinction, the text merits direct citation from the recent Young translation. Quote, "World is not a mere collection of things, countable and uncountable, known and unknown, that are present at hand. Neither is a world merely an imaginary framework added by our representation to the sum of things that are present. World worlds and is more fully in being than all those tangible and perceptible things in the midst of which we take ourselves to be at home. World is never an object that stands before us and can be looked at. By contrast, Heidegger says the following about earth. Earth is the coming forth concealing. Earth is that which cannot be forced, that which is effortless and untiring. On and in the earth, historical humanity founds its dwelling in the world. In setting up a world, the work of art sets forth the earth. Setting forth is to be thought here in the strict sense of the word. And by that he means his special sense of what that means. The work moves from the earth into the open of a world, and it holds it there. The work lets the earth be an earth. He's tying together the work of art, earth and world. Heidegger has turned to such a distinction in order to deliver on his insistence that while a work of art is a thing, it is not simply a thing. Pressing down hard on the distinction between setting forth and setting up, Heidegger presents the work as the sort of thing that arises at the point of articulation between the world it sets up and the earth it sets forth. More specifically, he attempts to grasp the truth of the work, its distinctive mode of disclosure, by interpreting this hinge under the sign of strife, despite, a conflict that arises as the work sets up and sets forth world and earth. Crucial here is the ontological difference between the two, suggesting that world worlds as it resists being earth and does so specifically in a work of art. Despite the special status accorded poetry in this lecture, that is characteristic of Heidegger's thought as a whole, if we note that Heidegger repeatedly and thus insistently throughout this discussion includes tones and what he calls the ringing of sounds among those things that in being works are not simply things, we're in a position to consider that music too worlds in animating the strife between world and earth. Phrased as a formula, world, music, worlds. Are these worlds the same or even similar? And we'll come back to earth. This nuances our chaosmos, and it does so in a decisive way, but a way whose formulation is enabled, I think, by turning to an earlier discussion of world in Heidegger, specifically his lengthy meditation on the worldhood, Weltlichkeit, or worldliness of the world. In Being in Time, this is where this discussion is most centrally concentrated upon. It happens in chapter 3 of part 1, and it is motivated by Heidegger's interpretation of the status of being in the world as concerns human being there, his technical term, Dasein. Those who've combed over these difficult passages will have noted that both earth and work are largely absent from them. Things remain prominent, but they are divided between the things of nature and things of value, the latter coming close to what Heidegger will later argue about works of art. As a consequence, the temptation is strong to read earth beneath or behind nature, but I think this is misleading. By the same token, things of value are divided between objects of concern, or what he calls equipment, things simply at hand, and other things, things present to hand. Despite these myriad and significant differences, when Heidegger lists the senses of world that matters to him, it is clear that if an expression like worldhood is not merely extravagant, it's because it speaks to the status of the world as part of this difficult and intricate structure of Dasein, a designation for the fact that the knowing of reality in ontological terms presupposes an exposure to and an encounter with what is in Dasein that is more than Dasein. The world is thus not in any ordinary sense out there. It is a designation for what in human being there obstructs its inwardness, its reduction to mere proprioceptive perception. Heidegger's repudiation of Descartes and the ontological contrast between the thinking thing and the extended thing here is brutal and quite unsparing. Perhaps most inadequate about this characterization of Heidegger's position is not primarily its cursory character, certainly that, but the fact that it does not yet address in any direct way music. Matters are not made any easier by the fact that works, and explicitly the work of art, is left entirely to the side in Being and Time. Matters are, however, made more interesting. Specifically, what happens to music is that it is deftly transposed from a thing composed of ringing sounds or tones to what is translated in the English as moods or being attuned, gestimmt sein. In the footnote that accompanies the introduction of this term in the text, the translators remind readers that its philological heritage is ancient, deriving initially from Pythagoras and bearing throughout its subsequent history a decisive accord with sound and the logic of attunement, or what Spitzer, as I mentioned earlier before, simply dubbed world harmony. But in what precise way does this make the articulation of world and music more interesting? I will resume the reading of Being in Time, even if rather cursory. David Welbury's perfunctory discussion of Franz Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption may be unforgivable, but I agree with him when he underscores the importance of the discussion of Stimmung in Being in Time that unfolds in section 29. There one reads, quote, "States of mind are so far from being reflected upon that precisely what they do is to assail Dasein in its unreflective devotion to the world with which it is concerned and on which it expends itself. A mood assails us. It comes neither from outside nor from inside, but arises out of being in the world as a way of such being." Note that arises from a being in the world, but with the negative distinction between state of mind and the reflective apprehending of something within, we've reached a positive insight into their moods, their character as a form of what he calls disclosure. The mood has already disclosed in every case being in the world as a whole, and it makes it possible, first of all, to direct oneself toward something. Here, Heidegger rather dramatically displaces the Kantian evocation of Stimmung as the means by which to conceive the entering into harmony or concord of the human faculties, say those of imagination and understanding, when faced with the materialization of non-proposive purpose, the kind of object that stirred Kant's thinking about art. He does so, Heidegger does so, by calling out its relation to the event of disclosure, the event whereby Dasein's encounter with world takes place within being attuned, gestimmt sein. Put differently, only through being attuned can Dasein engage its there, its sense of being in place, directed towards something other than itself. Although provocative, Heidegger's subsequent discussion of anxiety, Angst, as a state of mind, a theme implicitly retrieved by Feld, heads away from what makes this discussion relevant to the problematic of world music, a development readily avoided by re-emphasizing the Pythagorean resonance of attunement. Buzzing within this resonance is the proposition that the world, not earth, but world, is indeed on a string. The Arlen Kohler standard, it's a popular tune, ties this string to the state of mind called love, narrowing the philosophical insight here to the unfathomable depth of a Coke commercial. But if approached as an evocation of the monochord, Pythagoras' PowerPoint, avant le lettre, I think we face different music, not a jingle. We face a music that, in disclosing under which conditions the world waxes and wanes, shifts from music to something else, and maybe sound is a reasonably good name for it. Although I'm going to appeal here to Wolfgang Ernst's evocation of what he calls sonicity to help. Not then music in or of the world, but world as effect of musicking, to invoke Chris Small's still reverberant neologism, music. To be clear, while this displacement might suggest that worldliness and world are isotopes, mere reality effects, the immanence Pythagoras seeks in the arithmetic of vibration and frequency evokes a materialism of precise sort that attracted the young Marx to Epicurean contingency. In other words, it's not just a metaphor of the material, it's an evocation of materialism. To begin to wrap things up, I've spoken long enough. I want to offer a few thoughts about the connection, as I see them, between Larry Kramer's recent book, The Hum of the World, and Ernst's discussion of sonicity. In 2016, Ernst gave the keynote address at the Sound Art Matters event in Aarhus. His remarks were titled, "Listening to Sonic Expressions with Media Archaeological Ears." This essay, after setting in motion several doctrinal tenets of media archaeology, meandered around to a set of propositions about sound studies. Indeed, it was here that Ernst mobilized the contrast between sound and sonicity. To put the polemical point crudely, sound studies has remained fixated on sound and resisted sonicity. That is, the enabling processual phenomena out of which sound emerges. Pressured during the Q&A that followed this address, Ernst asserted that musicology was the oldest field within which the temporality of process mattered, and that for this reason, sound studies ought to acknowledge this debt, overcome its nostalgia for the pre-digital, and welcome its disciplinary subsumption within musicology. A version of this conclusion was stated in the question from the floor, and Ernst began his response by noting, "I could not have said it better myself." Since both interlocutors were more interested in the disciplinary angle, sound studies, musicology, nothing more was really said here about musicology, or music for that matter, leaving everyone within range of the exchange to wonder whether attention to processuality covered the matter. Sonicity, above and beyond its contrast with sound, assumed a certain metonymic function in Ernst's remarks, indexing a variety of instances where he would invoke the depth of algorithmic coding as what escaped researchers unwilling or unprepared to attend to it. Despite his titular evocation of the ears, Ernst did not dwell on the matter of perception, or what Larry Kramer in The Hum of the World calls the tension between the audible and the audible. It's kind of hard to hear, so I'll try to stress that when I repeat that. Internationally recognized as a leading critical musicologist, Kramer's interest in the hum would presumably be of keen interest to someone advocating for the subsumption of sound studies within musicology. But apart from the straightforward biographical matter of acquaintance or textual familiarity, other more difficult matters seem to interfere. Kramer does not even write, even early in his study, music is one of the, Kramer does even write early in his study, music is one of the foundations of hearing. Or even more provocatively, there is no sound without music. Both are formulations that might suggest Ernst and Kramer are on the proverbial same page, that they agree about the foundational status of music in the study of sound. They are not on the same page. Having underscored the matter of the ear in Ernst, it's important now to stress that sonicity does not square with what Kramer is scanning for in his neologism of the audible, even though clearly he wants to set it off against the audible. Regarding the former, Kramer writes, and here's a series of maxims that I'm just going to cite for him. Quote, "The audible is the material promise of sound." Maxim 2, "The audible is the precursor of sound to come, yet it is also experienced through hearing as if auditory sensation had a future tense." Maxim 3, "The audible is the hum of the world." Maxim 4, "The audible is the undertone of auditory culture." What emerges here in this series of formulations is Kramer's interest in potentiality, one might say the virtuality of sound. While the audible is not yet audible, it can be listened for. It can be made present to human perception. The becoming of this sonorous present, its potentiality, is a source of pleasure, and thus ultimately music, and see his reflection in this text called "No Sound Without Music." Okay? In other words, music is in coming to us, producing this kind of audible pleasure. In contrast to these positions, sonicity eludes both audibility and audibility. It makes no essential reference to the human. Perhaps this is also why Ernst shows little interest in a term that repeats in Kramer's study, world. It's in his title, it's over the text, world, world. The audible, as he says, is the hum of the world, implying one might think that the book might also have simply been titled The Audible. But what of this world in Kramer? Although he calls out Heidegger by name, he invokes both tone and attunement, and he associates the ghostly presence of the audible with the Pythagorean monochord. He does not settle down, even when laying out his philosophy of listening, to tell us what happens to world when it becomes hum. He does insist that hearing is the sense by which the world permeates the human, and later the pleasure consummated in music is the sound that attaches us to the heard world. But without noting that attachment and permeation are not only different, but that they call up rather different worlds, worlds whose collision ought to matter more than I think it does, even for Kramer. Risked here is a repetition of the charge made against Heidegger, namely that world, like poetry for Heidegger, is just a metaphor in Kramer. What is it a metaphor for emerges sharply, I think, in contrast with Ernst. It is a metaphor for the human, the bearer of the ears, that in the end, the media archaeologist invokes only to set aside. The music that attaches us to the heard world invites a world in which Ernst's musicology is utterly uninterested. The world in his thinking whose time has come and gone. But what then of the earth? As noted, this concept is largely left in the shadow in Heidegger's Being Time. It encroaches through Umwelt, or environment, surroundings, but surely the more interesting, if not strictly Heideggerian engagement with earth and sound is the one I invoked earlier in Doug Kahn's Earth Sound, Earth Signal. Published in 2013, this text is a series of soundings, each of which examines, as the text subtitles, energies and earth magnitudes implies, instances. They all seem to be exemplifications of something he calls natural radio. Starting with Edison and Watson, Kahn teases out the aesthetic implications of the electromagnetic bleed, then in haunting point-to-point audio transmission, situates what Cage once called the future of music, not in an inaccessible silence, but in, among other things, whistlers. That is, the massive electromagnetic discharges played, literally produced, by the earth. In thus reading earth sounds as signals, Kahn regrounds the concept of the aeolian, discussed at length in Kramer, in the non-hieratic music of the sphere, tracing how the significance of this gesture snaps, crackles, and pops within the work of everyone from Alvin Lucier to Pauline Oliveros. Because its angle is routinely more ethnographic, more empirical, Kahn also values unmediated natural relations of these proto-musical phenomena, missing, I think, the theoretically provocative tension between earth and world and work of art to be found in Heidegger. To be sure, his discussion obliges us to hesitate before Spitzer's rendering of Stimmung as world harmony. But our earth signals, merely to be understood, is the more originary dissonance of an earth on the wane. If being attuned is where world and something resembling music can no longer be differentiated, how are we to approach what the earth is performing? Is it attuning us to what never circulates in or as world music? If, as Jean-Luc Nancy has argued, philosophy cannot listen, it only understands, it cannot listen. Perhaps even such questions must remain, in some sense, unheard of. I think there's more here than Horatio's dilemma. This is Said and Pascal Casanova's dilemma as well. Casanova writing about the concept of world literature. Where in the world is worlding taking place, if not precisely in those mediations that diagram the violent unevenness of a waning that has reached terrestrial proportions. Ernst may be right, but for the wrong reasons. Musicology may indeed have an unanticipated, unheard of role to play in the current conjuncture, but certainly not simply because it keeps track of time. More urgently, in whatever form it is, assuming as it metabolizes the ethno prefix, musicology compels us to take seriously the notion that no theoretically informed social reading of our present is possible, not even possible, without taking up and taking in the worlds of what we still call music. I'm going to stop the reading there. I've gone plenty of time. I'd be very happy to talk with folks if you wish to talk.
Bravo, John. Please feel free just to kind of jump in or write things in the chat if you prefer to remain behind the kind of the dark cloud of Zoom. But whatever, yeah, open to the floor now. So nobody wants to do the first question, so it's okay. I had something kind of I've been thinking about as you were speaking, in terms of like the ontological aspect of, well, which kind of manifests in multiple different ways within your paper, most directly with the audioable aspect of a kind of in a state of becoming, which obviously connects to your wider work around sound and sound studies. But I thought, in particularly in relationship to figures and music, which is kind of which has a kind of refrain which comes back, which seems, if we think about Oliveros, Eastman, these figures that we're taking up this year, what is it for these things to kind of, you know, the rediscovery or the re-emergence of these things, and how does that affect their kind of relationship to the world or worlding, as you kind of posited within your paper? I suppose the refrain of them as in terms of their music and the performance of their music.
Yeah, I mean, I would say a few things in response. I mean, one of the things that people like Ernst and the media archaeologists, perhaps more generally, like to stress is the way that they think about the past as being rather more like the way Foucault thinks about the layering of archaeological strata. The notion being it's not so much about how far away it is from you. It has something to do with what sequence one discovers these things in. And in doing that, you know, I think, you know, they like to give us examples like, oh, we thought that the typewriter was obsolete until, you know, a variety of different kind of performance artists, graphic artists, musicians, you know, started saying, no, it's still here. And in fact, it's ahead of us. I mean, I like that thinking, even if I don't always agree with the way it's philosophically defended. And I think that speaks to what you're saying, Sam. I mean, we are encountering figures, and we're encountering them in ways that, yeah, do invite us not just to listen anew or even for the first time, but, you know, even to raise questions on the order of, well, why haven't I heard that before? Why didn't I listen before? And that then becomes a quite rich question that's got things having to do with history, with politics, with a variety of things. And so I think of that as being, you know, part of what's important in sort of coming to re-listen or to re-encounter these figures. They're not just from our past, even if it's a very, very recent past. I mean, Pauline Oliveros died recently. Eastman somewhat longer ago. It's not a matter of where chronologically. It's got to do with this idea of encountering in some sequence that at points allows you to see the past coming from in front of you. And that's something that I think Kramer's trying to get at with that audible. He tends to phrase it in terms of innovation, that there are things that we know we will recognize as, oh, that's innovative. I've not heard something like that before. And he's got that sense that everything that we're listening to has that audibility in it, that we are going to have this kind of encounter. I do feel that, he's not a terribly careful philosophical thinker. So when he's invoking things like ontology, I think he's largely doing it in a kind of sort of shorthand way. He's using ontology to say, look, I think that it's got something fundamental to do with the way we exist, but it's also important to say it's not just a matter of what we know about existence or we think about existence. He uses it to just sort of get away from, oh, I see, you're just representing an experience of listening. You're just representing the hum. He's saying, no, I don't mean that. I'm trying to get at some point at which we and hum belong. But it's not really worked out very carefully in terms of, what it means to invoke a theory of being in this context. But, that's not his aim. That's not his training, really.
I've got a question with Sean, but just a small follow-up from my question in terms of specifically about kind of time and kind of, I suppose, a destabilization of a kind of chronological or kind of teleological, I think is the kind of reference you brought up. But do you think in that sense that the calling of musicology as a kind of in the way musicology has dealt with the idea of time or temporality, do you think that we need something else there, I feel like that maybe doesn't do the kind of destabilizing of time that this research requires?
Well, I mean, if we follow Ernst to the end of the line, what you get to is a sense of time that is, being measured in terms of atomic clocks. In other words, what kind of time are we talking about when we're dealing with it at that scale and in relation to those kinds of measuring devices? In this particular argument, all he's trying to do is to say that feature of sonicity, its algorithmic flux, is something that is so outside of our perception of time that we need to just keep reminding ourselves that even if musicology is interested, and it is in very sophisticated ways, and especially if we start thinking about musicology as it's attending to, just for the lack of a better expression, musics around the world. There's a sense there in which all he's really saying is, look, that's a crucial feature. And sound studies, in his mind, is always thinking in terms of historical time. When did this device happen? And what impact did the happening of this device have on the human perception of speech or listening, whatever it might be? that may not be fair. I'm just trying to say that's the kind of argument that he's pursuing there. And he's just stressing, look, historical time isn't good enough. We need a much more diversified, much subtler sense of time. I mean, even somebody like Said, has a concept of how space renders time heterogeneous. And, the South African artist William Kentridge has done some beautiful work on this theme. It's developed around the call, give us back our sons. And it's meant to be a pun, yes, but it's also about this sense that the movement of the earth around the sun, which has a kind of temporal indexicality, is also something subject to incredible, geologic differentiation. And there are important ways in which times are unfolding at different rates and in relation to different measurements. I think Ernst is just saying, I feel like in comparison to sound studies, musicology has been much more interested in that. Now that leaves a lot of things about what musicology has been interested in to the side. And he's being, I think his goal there is to just be provocative. He's addressing a group of sound studies scholars. And so he's coming at them by saying, I think you've fallen behind here. We talk about you as though you're the cutting edge of humanities research or research in the sciences, even the biomedical sciences, but maybe not so. It leaves a lot to be said, it seems to me, and he doesn't spend time saying it.
But I think we're already starting to establish that these kind of orbiting kind of planets, what time being something that's going to keep going back as we particularly look through Oliveros and Eastman and with Cage obviously in the background. I want to move over to Sean, who's actually written something into the chat here, and he wondered whether you could this is Sean Parkinson, very good artist and PhD student of the school. Could you talk a little bit more about Spitzer and his proclamation of the death of Stimmung, circa 1945, and what has happened in the world, do you think, that has caused the concept, attunement, mood, etc., to re-emerge, especially in music sound studies? And what are we tuning into now that we were perhaps out of tune till now?
Thanks, Sean. I think that the project that Spitzer sets out on is very much oriented around a kind of scanning through Christian and pre-Christian accounts of harmony. And it's a project very much informed by the war. It's very much informed by the kind of declaration that comes out of Nietzsche and gets repeated in different ways in Blumenberg, that the death of God, there's no transcendental instance. There's no kind of point at which we would fix something like A440. That's gone. So do we have a way of thinking about what holds things in accord? And so Spitzer sets out to figure out how Christianity, in spite of these declarations about what does modernity mean and what does it mean to be in a world where there's no transcendental instant, that strikes me as a project that is informed by this kind of a belief in the scholar to intervene in a moment of crisis, to think the terms of something that survives. I think that the issue about, you know, why this becomes interesting again. I mean, if you think about the people who've been worrying about it more recently, like David Welbury and Gumbrecht, you know, they're sort of going at it from the vantage point of, well, this is an aesthetic concept that has fallen out of favor. And it fell out of favor during the period when a certain kind of Euro-critical theory began to assert its intellectual influence. Because Stimmung always seemed to have something to do with something like accord and the suppression of difference and the priority of voice, Stimme, you know. All those things I think were perceived as having been released into oblivion too early, and that there are reasons for coming back to begin thinking about this. And I would say that, you know, one of the intriguing things has been that part of, you know, that strong philosophical, largely French focus on the kind of critique of phonocentrism and the voice and speech, and one of the important residues in that was the interest in yes, that's fine, that, you know, a model of sort of interior consciousness is that we hear ourselves speak, but what do we sound like? I mean, it's just sort of that sense of, well, wait a minute now, we didn't really answer that question. And I feel as though there's a sense here, not so much of we've neglected this, but we've gotten ourselves into other quandaries where appeal to these kinds of ideas become interesting. I think too, it's you know, it's a way, it's a somewhat more authentic way to name what we often try to capture using the catch-all interdisciplinarity. We use that to talk about the way difference articulates itself by scholars of different training and heritage coming together and saying, so, well, in our field, it looks like this. That seems to me to be a very superficial understanding of what's going on with interdisciplinarity. And I like the idea of sort of thinking about Stimmung as a way of reminding us that we want to get at how something can be touched without being either destroyed or converted. And that seems to me to be an important thematic, really, as we've been trying to figure out, so what's going on in the world, who's doing what to whom, how do we engage this, where is music, where is sound art, where is installation art, where are these practices in Heidegger's thinking, where are these works of art engaging the strife between world and earth? I think that's acquired a different kind of resonance for us now. And I use resonance there deliberately. So I would say that about Spitzer, and I would say these kinds of things about our moment.
And Mikhail, I don't know if he's still there. I wonder whether I could be very cheeky and bring you in here a little bit, because particularly in terms of this kind of emergence of strife emerging between world and earth, but also, you know, your work, you're known as an artist, is often literally using the kind of sounds of the earth, whether, you know, think of Child of Unquiet, where, you know, the Tuscan thermodynamic landscape is actually part of the kind of instrumentation of the piece. I wonder whether you had any responses to John's talk. Sorry, Mikhail, sorry.
That's like putting me on the spot. I mean, I was really, you know, as John was, as you were talking, I was looking actually on looking up at the different references that you were mentioning, and I felt, in many respects, I felt kind of out of my depth, because
Depth.
in terms of engaging with these themes through discourse, because I'm approaching a lot of the themes you've talked about, through practice. And perhaps a figure that we haven't really, I can't remember if you mentioned
Schaefer.
Schaefer, Maurice Schaefer, and the tuning of the world. I don't remember you mentioning it.
Don't think so.
You didn't, but there's a very inspiring section in which he's quoting an anthropological observation report, in which he talks about a tribe in Africa.
Oh yeah.
Do you remember that section? Maybe for the sake of the rest of the the people attending, I'm going to mention it, in which the various members of the tribe would go out to hunt, and to they would be immersed in nature during the day, and then they would gather in the later in the afternoon, and they would describe the experience of being in that environment through mimicry. So there's something about harmonizing with, embodying, and reproducing through mimicry, reproducing the sonic environment, which I found very inspiring. I mean, my initial, this has been a methodology I've been using in several projects. It was initiated when I started, it was totally intuitive. But somehow through his writings, I became to understand it in a different way. You are familiar with that particular. So what are your reflections on that in relation to attunement, in relation to any of the concepts you talked about, the audible and the audible?
Well, I should probably say I'm not entirely persuaded by what Kramer's trying to do there. I mean, I'm always interested in the way scholars struggle with trying to formulate these kinds of insights. So I'm fascinated. And of course, when thinking about the tuning of the world, I couldn't not look at a book called The Hum of the World, philosophy of listening. Anyways, I mean, what I think, well, Schaefer is a really interesting character, right? Because he's not only a scholar, he's a musician. And he's not just a musician in the sense of someone who composes works. And they often have very, very striking, very beguiling ways of setting themselves in some kind of natural frame. I mean, if he wants to do something that's about winter and the cold and voices being heard across ice or snow, he's thinking very, I think, smartly about, well, what kinds of instrumentation are going to be required. And some of those instruments are not going to be the sorts of things that you would expect to see in an orchestra pit. That they're just not that. Now, he's also trying to think about, as he puts it, and I've stolen, shamefacedly, I've stolen this tuning of the world. I mean, he's very alert to the way in which these experiences, and precisely the one that you're recalling here, these experiences are exemplifications and nuance of what it means to think of the world being tuned. Now in the book, he recycles that flood print from the 17th century where we see, the monochord, and we see clearly the hand of God, is there tuning that instrument. And my sense is that in the examples that you're reminding us of, what he's after is some of the ways in which, in a much more ordinary, routine, this is a group of people who are doing something they do all the time, and under certain conditions, they experience the musicality of what they do. And I think that is, it's one of these things that I'm trying to tease out of this thinking about Heidegger. It has to do with this sense that it's not just that you're entering into relation with heat and the rise, the optical illusion of heat rising. It's not just that you're encountering those things out there and entering into some kind of resonance with them. Heidegger's also trying to stress that insofar as you can perceive this, it's because you as a human thing are already attuned. You're receptive. You've got some kind of preparation that allows these things to take on the form they then take on when you share them with others. This is what happened when. But I think he's trying to do something there that I very much want to honor or respect, even as I'm thinking about the need to keep pushing on this idea of, it's not happening to a subject, it's happening as the subject. There's something about that is what Stimmung, I think, is trying to lay hands on. But it's a great bit. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yes, thank you for the response. I'm not going to take more time. Perhaps in response to this, I'm going to mention that what you are saying resonates in this idea of what's happening as the subject rather than to the subject.
Yeah.
What that brings to mind is practices of weather making. Something that I've been studying recently. I've been watching different documentaries on academic studies and documentaries on people who are forecasting on the weather or tuning into the weather, different traditions of weather making and how that is connected with supposedly secret practices, but also acute observation and this kind of attunement and tuning in, and which I think are very, very interesting and very relevant to what you are talking about.
Yeah. I mean, the other connection I would make, I'll be brief because I know others have things to say. I don't know if you know Igor Reznikov. I mean, he's an acoustic archaeologist, and he's very interested in thinking about cave art and spaces of resonance. And he's got some very sharp things to say about how a subject, and specifically this sense of the human and the non-human animal, produce this encounter, sonic encounter, that is, very important historically in terms of setting in motion this idea of, what a hominid might be.
That's a fantastic segue to the question from Dan Vibra, our new friend and colleague in the faculty, who wanted to ask about you to talk a little bit more about that question of an encounter, how that could be pushed further. It implies a meeting point between discrete units, individuals. Maybe we could say music at its foundation is about entanglement, indiscretion. thinking on his feet. But do you think there's anything to go on with that?
Very much so. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that is very important in dealing with this move in somebody like Ernst towards the algorithmic. It reminds us of how we think about information, what forms it takes, what media it circulates in, what kinds of logic it exemplifies, etc. But one of the important figures in this, and certainly in thinking about materialism from the standpoint of the tradition we associate with Marxism, one of the important figures here is Lucretius, and this idea of, basically matter in movement and not really being anything more than inert or rife with potential until this kind of accident, this swerve, as he puts it, the clinamen, brings information out through an encounter, through some kind of collision, if you will. Now, the argument there is tricky because the claim is that in some sense, as particles are falling vertically, they don't exist. It's only retroactive that they exist once the chance element that brings them into a systemic relation with one another arises. And I think that there's a very important way in which that is absolutely at the foundation of what the late Althusser, Louis Althusser, called the philosophy of the encounter. And my feeling is that these are ways of trying to get at a different kind of explanation of historical causality, and explanations of historical causality that invite, attention from the likes of people like Ernst and Kramer and all of us who are thinking about, well, how is it that sonic gesturing is part of what it is that we understand. It's not just happening to things, but in things, as things. And I think that there's a very strong sense there in which that particular thinking about the encounter is relevant, it seems to me, to pretty much any kind of exploration of how people interact in common to produce something that wasn't possible prior to the interaction. The interaction generates the conditions for what emerges. That is certainly crucial to what we understand by improvisation. I don't know how many biographies you will read of musicians, popular or otherwise, where they'll talk about, the formative impact of encountering somebody carrying a record, someone showing up at a shows, that something emerges from those kinds of moments that I feel are absolutely fundamental to the way music happens. The ones, there are all kinds of versions of this that arise broadly within the sphere of world musics, where you pair up people. You pair up Sekou Keita and Catherine Finch, and you get these harpists from very different places interacting and producing music together. And there's an encounter there that generates a kind of sonic field that encounter is absolutely the source for. And there too, I mean, that for me, that's another fascinating way to think in terms of tuning. A Celtic harp and a kora are not tuned in the ways we might expect. And in fact, there are many koras that you have to invoke in order to, or literally have with you in order to play along with, because the tunings are incompatible, you know. But they can be brought into. And so how is it that you think about that? It's not that you're literally, you know, tuning them to some
Entrainment.
pitch. You're finding the way to make them, as I like to say, you know, touch without converging. But yeah, I mean, I think encounter fundamental.
I think also, because I've got you on my shoulder here, John, as I say this, but you can't help but think about encounters with, you know, aliens, people from outer space, because at those moments, you know, we often, you know, conjure, you know, sound or temperament. You know, it's interesting that the solfege is using obviously in close encounters, but then more recently in The Arrival, we had Joan LaBarbera in one of our early cave events talking about how her voice was then used as the kind of heptapods in Arrival. But there's something about, even at this moment of the infinite possibilities of worlds or tunings, that we go back to the kind of like, you know, even further to the Western idea of like kind of a tempered equal temperament system. But the encounter is always there in terms of something which is completely alien. Anna or
Hey.
Eric.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, sorry.
Eric.
I'm sorry. It's kind of a letdown just to be me. I don't know why I'm Anna, but here I am. Thank you, John. That was a totally magnificent, fascinating thing as usual, but totally unique. I don't, you know, I'm myself, I'm unqualified to intervene, but it's irresistible. I did want to say something. I was sort of thinking of saying something maybe in the direction of some of the things you said about Heidegger, and trying to go in the direction of ask you about the compatibility with a more psychoanalytic interpretation of some of those things. So some of what you were just saying about what I think of as the kind of bootstrapping of anyway. But that was my second question. My first one was about birds, and it made me think that I heard some years ago a little piece by accident on the radio about some people who went with these super high definition. Can you hear me? Yeah. With these super high definition recordings of bird songs, and what they said was, I mean, I may be sort of halfway making this up, but so it's a technical question. It's like the sample rate was unbelievably high, and it's not something that, I don't know, anybody had bothered to do before or was able to do before. And what they seemed to be saying was there was this whole world that nobody knew was there, and that what we hear is just little superficial and very, and actually, you know, they unpack it, and there's this huge amount of, I mean, what they talk about it is as information potentially, right? So there's this huge amount of information that's actually packed into this thing on this super different. It's a question of time, right? Yeah. And so, I mean, one of my made me think was sort of almost a question of translation. And I guess I've never really thought of translation, which is something I'm used to thinking about in terms of attunement. You know, that's one question: is to what extent could you translate the whole package of thinking around translation into a question of tuning and attuning? And maybe not, and maybe that's absolutely the wrong thing to do. Though I do feel that the question of translation does, I mean, one of one's warinesses might be to signifying everything, you know, significationizing everything. But I do feel that in some sense translation is precisely one of the places where language isn't simply a question of, you know, meaning, content in any, or transfer in anything, in any case. But it's almost like one of the things that bird example made you think was that there's also a kind of ontological question, because what they're saying is that the birds have this whole other we're present with the birds, but they're having this completely other experience, and possibly even in their communication with us, that their experience of time is there's sort of an ontological question of the experience of time that sort of brings to the fore in a way that's really seemed really bizarre, as we do and we don't inhabit the same world and the same sound world, but the same. And so on the one hand, is this like a metaphor for all of our relations? Maybe we're all talking to birds, even as we talk to each other. You know what I'm saying? We hear the same thing, but in some sense we don't. But there's also that crazy thing of like a millisecond. I mean, it has to do with sample rates in some ways, but like a millisecond, there's a sort of super relativity in what the experience of a millisecond is, and what. I guess there's a time sound question. That felt to me like it was really, really bizarre and interesting, and an ontological question, because it throws. I don't know. It just felt to me there'd be lots to say. And I was just wondering if that sparks anything for you. Maybe can I just say quickly the other question I was saying about the bootstrapping and that whole Heideggerian thing of you sort of already know, you're already in it before you're in it. You don't. It's not like you're outside and then you go in it, but you're in some sense you have to already be in it in order to get into it somehow. And it just felt to me, a little bit like just was, it's just. I just happened to be the other week teaching the mirror stage, and I was trying to point out that here's a trauma that happens. I mean, the question of the event happening not to but as the subject. Mm-hmm. One of the things that you see very clearly there is that here's this trauma that doesn't happen to a subject. Right. It's this originary trauma, that original Oedipal thing, or whatever you want to do, the alienation. There's nobody there for it to happen to. It's the process, and it's this completely impossible. It doesn't make any sense, right? You can't, and I mean, even the way Lacan describes it, there's this crazy thing where there's this little kid who doesn't exist, and by the end of the sentence, he's sitting there, leaning forward and grabbing his image and interiorizing it. It's pure fiction, but you have to bootstrap somehow. You have to get there somehow, and you have to already be in before you're in, and that's the whole trauma theory thing of this trauma that isn't treatable. Once you've had that, then you become a subject to whom traumas can happen, and you might be able to, deal with them. But this one, it's not even really a trauma, because it doesn't happen to anyone, because it's the place where the someone happens. Anyway, I just felt like that linked up really nicely. It was a beautiful talk.
I think that's right. I mean, you started out by presenting it as kind of a following out of what I had been saying about Heidegger. So it seems right, to take this opportunity to simply note that there's a very important sense here in which we are thinking about how Heidegger deals with or doesn't Freud. And there's all kinds of evidence in Being in Time from the mid-20s, where he's very alert to Freud's presence. I mean, it's not uninteresting that the dominant mood state in Being in Time is anxiety. It's not uninteresting that one of the concepts upon which he lingers at length in Being in Time is the uncanny. He's certainly, trying to engage but hold at a distance this kind of question, because he doesn't want to really wrestle with the significance of the unconscious. I don't think he wants to really sit down and say, what do I have to say to Freud about this? Now, that said, as you point out, there's something there's something very much like this idea of this founding alienation being the condition for which something that can only come into existence in the wake of that alienation, that experience is not unlike what he's trying to get to with this kind of pre-apprehension of the world. But he's arguing so directly against his philosophical forebears. So Kant and Descartes are the ones he wants to find the weaponry to avoid. So he ends up worrying too much about, do we have to have a theory of mind in which we have the right kinds of rational, capacities in order for us to have reason, in order for us to know. And he's good at saying, this whole discussion about things in themselves, it's all of that misses that we need something else in place first. So there's a, I guess what I would say is that there's a kind of potential articulation between these positions that would be very interesting. But you'd have to bring Kierkegaard into the picture, who works out a concept of anxiety that both Freud and Heidegger are trying to get clear about. Anyway, so on the bootstrap issue, yeah, I would say there's a lot of threading there to kind of work through.
I'd love to see a more, in terms of the idea of the threading and Eric's question, I'd love to maybe extend conversations later on about the work of tuning and in relationship to kind of the analytical kind of, the hermeneutics of the analytical untangling, and how the tuning or detuning could be kind of like, compared, or how we could learn from these different kind of modes. There's obviously room. We've had many conversations between us over the years, but there is room for that, I think.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things that would be a good place to start is, around Reich's concept of the third ear. What kind of an ear is that? What does it hear? How does it listen? There's a very rich set of possibilities there. Just quickly on the birds, this is exactly Ernst's point, that there's so much happening, that so much of sound studies, which proclaims itself to be interested in, just doesn't have the capacity to deal with. And it's partly because there's this set of assumptions about what fits and what's worthy of making sense of, and that's the problem right there, right? Is trying to get at how we put the boundary up about what matters and what doesn't, and how we attend to it. I mean, there's a lot of work though in acoustical engineering, in dealing with hearing impairment, that's trying to find the way to think about how acoustical oral information is simulatable, such that it can be amplified, such that it can be passed through induction loops and what have you, that really do head toward what Ernst is worrying about. How are we computing our way of thinking about what's going on with sound, even human hearing? There's been an enormous amount of work done on birds and bird song, bird sound. There's a great anecdote of Adorno's about listening to radio, during which the simulation of a bird's call is being broadcast. And at the moment he receives this radio signal, he hears a bird outside the window, and the radio broadcast ends up being perceived by him as the more authentic sound. of the bird's call. But, you know, this is the kind of thing that people have been thinking about in terms of the origins of human language.
That's the mirror stage right there.
How do intervals, meaningful intervals, how do you bundle phonemes? How separate do the sounds have to be in order for them to be perceptible? But yeah, I mean, I would say if we start thinking about that kind of activity, you know, then we do really get at this multiple possible worlds, and not in space, but right here.
And I thought it was worthwhile at this point bringing in Stockhausen's Stimmung, I think 1968, 69, whereas actually like through the kind of manipulation of the mouth and going through across the vowel shapes,
Yep.
you know, the performers and the audience discover all of these overtones and harmonic sequences that are normally kind of passed over or, in terms of normal tunings.
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing that artists are often doing, and musicians, composers, they're actually putting these things into a kind of active consciousness in terms of this kind of tuning in a way that is done theoretically elsewhere, obviously. But yeah, so worth having listened to Stimmung, if for those who haven't heard it.
Yeah, totally. I think it also would be fun to put the recording of a bird song through auto-tune and see what decisions it makes.
Any final questions, thoughts for ideas, Scott? To complete the circle, Dr. Scott McLaughlin, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for that, John. That was great. I wanted to bring it. Well, I had two angles. I don't want to ask both of them, but I'll let you pick. I had one angle on Gibsonian affordances on this, and affordance as a form of perception and tuning in,
yeah,
and how things become real, or not real. How things come to exist when we tune into them, when we perceive them in that way. And the other side then was thinking in terms of something like Donna Haraway and that continuous becoming with and ongoingness that she has, which seems to me to relate a lot to what you're talking about the not touching but coming together, things coming into phase and aligning with each other. So for me, both of these things relate to each other, but they're also they're from two different sides. So I wondered if you had anything to go on with either of those.
Well, I mean, it's going to feel a little bit arbitrary, but Donna Haraway is someone with whom I've had a long conversation about crows and crow songs, and I know that she's, you know, very keen to think about the ways in which some of the understandings of what's going on in crows' calls, not so much song, but calls, and the calls, certainly they have pulses, and so there's a rhythm and there's a kind of melodic quality. But you know, she doesn't like, and I'm with her on this, she doesn't like this idea that what we need to do here is to think about them as ways of understanding the definition of territory. You know, that the bird call is actually staking out a space through the sound and is using that signaling system to, among other things, set up the friend-enemy relation, or, you know, the suitor-suited relation. So, and I know that she, you know, very much thinks in terms of these points at which there's these convergences that are generative, that are kind of non-computable. You can't I mean, you could reproduce, but that's all you're doing. You're not actually innovating. You're not generating, because that's where you run afoul of the way you want to submit this to an information gathering principle. Yeah, so I'm very interested in the way she tries to get at, even in the sort of sense of, when species meet, that notion of meet is something that I very much associate with this idea of touching without converging. I was invited to talk out at Santa Cruz before she retired, and while Cayenne, her dog, was still with her, and I was sort of gobsmacked, I guess, when we got to the home. She immediately marches into the space where the dog has been sleeping and invites the dog to dance, and sets up this little circle where she doesn't even ask me, are you allergic to dogs? Are you afraid of dogs? Just, and there's this way of being in the world with her where you really get that sense that, yep, it's all happening all the time, and the things that are happening are producing what's there. It's not you brought it in, you're producing what's there. So I'm very sympathetic with that line of thinking. Now, affordances, also these become ways of trying to get at where these encounter points, right, have a certain receptivity. And I think that's also part of the way one would hold on to this idea of the touching without converging. So there's a point at which you will go too far. The affordances will crumble, and something that you're not trying to produce is generated. Anyways, just a few things, and thank you very much for that. Thank you for reminding me of Donna.
I've got one quick line. Just I happened to skim through Staying with the Trouble just to see where she mentions attunement. But she has a lovely line somewhere where one of the many times she says something like this, but where she talks about becoming less deadly, more response able, more attuned, more capable of surprise. I love that connection, more attuned and more capable of surprise. Anyway.
Yeah, no, but I think that's encounter again, that sense of, I didn't come here for this, but this happened. Yeah.
Well, man, I feel like we've fallen onto an amazing moment to kind of bring things to an end. And Ed's note in the chat that Crow 2 was actually a ritualized performance piece with Oliveris and Eastman. So, there are synergies and resonances, continuing to form. Thank you so much, John. That was really, really special, and thank you to all of those who contributed.
Thank you.
Recording will go up at some point, for us to kind of to kind of look again and spend more time. Just please look out for the remaining events, and have a lovely season of celebration, whatever you'll be doing or not doing, and I'll see you all in January for more tuning, and some really wonderful events we've got lined up. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, lovely. Stay with the trouble.